People should read Footnotes because it's an American story. It's a great story if you love theater. It's a great story if you love history, but it's just sort of a great story about overcoming the odds, overcoming adversity, um, living in your authentic truth, succeeding, and then what one has to do to hold on to success. And there are interpersonal factors, there are business factors, there are societal factors, there's fame, there's drama. And, we've seen stories like this told in different facets, but I don't know if I've ever read a story where it has been a story about theater, where Black people have been at the center of that story in the 1920s. And just to set the scene for you a little bit, the 1920s was an amazingly challenging time for New York. It was the Prohibition era. It was the very beginning of Prohibition. And one of the things that I discovered while I was writing the book was New York State actually had derived 75% of its total revenue from the legal sale of alcohol before Prohibition. I mean, 75%, that's nuts. But that's a statewide figure. And so when Prohibition set in, it completely decimated New York. This is right after World War I. This is right after the greatest period of racialized violence in the United States since the Civil War. The Tulsa Massacre, which you may be familiar with, was 1 week after Shuffle Along's debut on Broadway. And so in this landscape, these Black artists were able to succeed in a country that was quite literally, one could argue, designed to trap them in failure. But they didn't fail. And yet, even once they succeeded, they had trouble holding on to that. And so, I'm a firm believer that a lot of the issues in this country and in this world could be resolved if we just were honest about our history. I think that we might have a more inclusive Broadway today if we remembered that there were all Black musicals on Broadway before The Wiz in 1975 or something like that, So it's important for that. And I think it's important to also share this story because it's a story that everyone can connect with in the same way that when I went to go see Hidden Figures, for example, I didn't know anything about the space race, besides what I knew from school. I didn't really care about NASA. I hadn't given it any thought in a long time, but there's just something about that story that connects with you because we've all had that feeling of not knowing if we could do something. And if we are lucky, we've had the experience of being the first to do something, right? But that takes courage and perseverance. And then once you're the first, how do you hold on to that? So I think Footnotes is something that you'll really enjoy, and I hope you check out and keep on your shelf. And then when people say, "What's that?" talk it up to them. Hi, my name is Caseen Gaines, and I am the author of Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way. And if you'd like to learn more about Broadway in the 1920s and the hit show Shuffle Along, then listen to this conversation. I first learned about Shuffle Along when I went to see George C. Wolfe's 2016 sort of reimagining is what I'm calling it, of Shuffle Along. So it was it really wasn't the original show. It was sort of a making of, but when I went to go see it, it was actually the day before it closed. And I was lucky enough to be a participant in an audience, in a Q&A, a talk back with some of the stars of the show. And there was just this real funereal atmosphere at the Music Box Theater where the show was being staged. And it felt, I was amazed watching this show, and it felt like, the show closed prematurely. It only ran for 100 performances, the 2016 production. And I felt like there was this great injustice being done to the original show and the original creators yet again. And so I didn't know at that time that I was going to write a book. And in fact, this book, Footnotes, sort of grows out of me tinkering around with a couple of other projects. Like I wanted to write something about diversity on Broadway kind of more broadly. And then that sort of became focused to looking at that 2016 season, which was the season that gave us Hamilton and On Your Feet and Eclipse and Allegiance and Shuffle Along. Color Purple revival was that same season. So it was a pretty great year for diversity on Broadway. And ultimately, I just kept feeling compelled to tell the story of Shuffle Along because it just seemed like an amazing case study for what happened to Black artists routinely over the course of the last almost century at that point. Now it's a full century. So that was when I first learned about it. But I just started digging around and cannot believe now. I did not know that it would be a 440 something page book, when I was sitting there watching the show. But it ended up being because there was just such a rich story to tell about the artist behind this musical. I felt like I needed to tell the story of Noble Sissle, Eubie Blake, Flournoy Miller, and Aubrey Lyles because I loved theater. I am a Black man, like they were all Black men. And I did not know of this show's existence until 2016. And there was something about that reality that was really sad to me, actually. And Audra McDonald, who starred in that production as Lottie G, she had not heard of Shuffle Along until 2015 when she was asked to be in it. And so it felt like, musical theater, particularly, always felt to me like something that was very sort of exclusive. It felt like something that you had to be of a certain income level to really partake in it, to go see it. Certainly if you wanted to be on stage, my goodness, you had better have had dance lessons and vocal lessons, and all of those things take time and take money, and not everyone has access to all of those things. If you wanted to write a Broadway show, certainly that was going to be a challenge because how are you ever going to get your words in front of a producer? What is going to make a producer take, your show over someone else's? And so I felt like when I thought about musical theater history and the musical theater canon and the Great American Songbook, Eubie Blake and Noble Sissle weren't there. Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles weren't there, but they were there. They had been there. And so it was important to me as a writer to sort of say, if there's something I can do to help preserve the history of what took place in the 1920s in New York with Shuffle Along and these artists, I will do that, especially since that 2016 production did not have a cast album, is not available for licensing. Like the show, even though it was on stage just 5 years ago, that 2016 show has also sort of disappeared. And it was in the same year as Hamilton. So it was immediately overcast. It was nominated for 10 Tony Awards. And does anyone remember that? It was the same year as Hamilton. It lost every single Tony it was nominated for. So it felt like if I could do something to create a document, right, that can sort of be put in the time capsule of history, I felt a responsibility to do that. So creating Footnotes was interesting for me because it was the first time I had written a book where all of my main subjects were no longer living. Usually I had the opportunity to interview people and call them up and get their recollections and have them look through their files and their photographs and things like that. But I really had to do a lot of research for this in, I guess I'll say, the conventional sense. So I went to lots of libraries, certainly New York Public Library, the Schomburg Center in Harlem. I At the time, it was called the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. That's where Eubie Blake has his archives. There are archives at Emory in Atlanta, where Flournoy Miller has some of his archives. And so there was a lot of digging to reconstruct this story. Shuffle Along was a unique musical back then because while Blacks had been on Broadway before and there were all Black shows that had played on Broadway, there had been none that commanded Broadway pricing. So there had been none that had really been qualified as Broadway shows. It would be like, as Eubie Blake put it, I won't say it. Eubie Blake said, you can put a flea circus and have it play on the corner of Broadway and 42nd. That doesn't make it a Broadway show. That's not to say that the other Black Broadway shows were flea circuses, but Shuffle Along was definitely a Broadway show in the way that we think about it now, even though it played on 63rd Street, which is outside of the theater district. So it was amazing because it was the first time jazz music was heard in a Broadway theater. It brought a revolutionary kind of music, jazz, all Black cast, all Black orchestra, all Black creative team. It also was interesting because Noble Sissle and Eubie Blake were always very refined performers. Noble Sissle actually had a part in the show, but then later on at the end of the second act, he and Eubie Blake would get up on stage and they would perform some of their vaudeville act in full tuxedos, really being very, prim and proper and suave. Meanwhile, Miller and Lyles, the comedians who wrote the book, they actually were Black actors who wore blackface. And so you had sort of this interesting melange of a show that was kind of, the new Negro, Harlem Renaissance sort of style and sound, meeting this sort of stereotypical antebellum Black humor. And because of that, Black and white audiences found something to enjoy in Shuffle Along. The other thing that was really important and innovative about Shuffle Along was the use of women in the show. There were women characters who were able to actually be full-fledged people, not just caricatures. And also there was a dancing chorus that really danced. At the time, women choruses were really like Ziegfeld Follies, where the women were more ornamental. They would sort of parade around the stage in nice costumes. But in Shuffle Along, they really were revered for their dancing and celebrated for their dancing and their talent and not just their beauty. And so those are all a part of what made Shuffle Along so successful back in 1921. Footnotes starts actually on opening night of Shuffle Along in 1921 at the 63rd Street Music Hall. And Noble Sissle, Flournoy Miller, and Aubrey Lyles are all ready to hightail it out of the theater and run to Harlem because they had been warned that white audiences, Broadway audiences in particular, who had paid a pretty penny to get into the show, may not like a romantic subplot where a Black man and a Black woman are expressing love for each other through song. That's it. I mean, just that in 1921 was taboo. And it was taboo because women prior to Shuffle Along, for the most part, had been caricatures on stage. They had either been mammies or, sexually hungry Jezebels or these sort of, tragic mulatto figures or something like that. And, just to have a Black woman who was on stage wanting to be in a relationship with a Black man was a mind-blowing experience. And there were legitimate thoughts that there could be a race riot that breaks out at the sight of this, that white audiences would not tolerate it. And so ultimately that does not happen. The crowd does end up erupting, but they erupt and ask for an encore of this song. But it was important to me to sort of throw us directly into the action and also just make it clear that while, yes, this is a book about musical theater and there's singing and dancing and comedy at the center of it, there were also really high stakes. In this book, there's murder, there's death, there's a whole lot of things that are going on in the world at this time, and Shuffle Along existed in that ecosystem. You can't divorce it from that time period. But the main story arc really follows the four men at the center of the story, Miller and Lyles and Sissle and Blake, and it charts how each of those men met their theatrical partner, and then how those two partnerships met, and ultimately what the factors were that tore them apart. They all continued to make Broadway shows after Shuffle Along, but Shuffle Along was the only production that they all collaborated on together. And so there's something really interesting about that. But it's really a group biography about those four men and the other artists whose lives intersected with theirs. Shuffle Along is really at the center of the story, but it's at the center of the story. There's a whole lot of other story that surrounds it. What I want the audience to get out of Footnotes is that representation is important. Representation gives way to more representation. When you see yourself in a space, it makes it easier for you to envision yourself in that space as well. And one of the things that the men behind Shuffle Along really understood was that a way to actually achieve representation is to live in your authentic truth, is to tell the stories that you want to tell in the ways that you want to tell them. You can see that in a show like Hamilton now, where it's telling the story of the founding of America, but it's doing it in a way that resonates with contemporary audiences. Shuffle Along did not try to be the work of George or Ira Gershwin. It tried to be Shuffle Along. It tried to be this new and innovative thing, and that's why it worked. So it's a story of being true to yourself and succeeding, but it's also a story about systemic racism. It's a story about the factors that lead to a show like Shuffle Along being forgotten and lost in history. And so while there is triumph in this story, it's also a little bit of a cautionary tale. And I think when you read Footnotes, you'll realize that there are lots of people and factors to blame for the erasure of Shuffle Along. It's not just, white producers or something like that. There are lots of reasons. And that's the way progress works sometimes. Sometimes, it's messy and it's, two steps forward, one step back, or vice versa. But the story of Footnotes is sort of a complicated story. I don't know. Someone asked me the other day, is it optimistic? Is it pessimistic? And I don't really know if it's either. And I don't really know if it has to be. I think life is complicated. This is a complicated story because it's about four people's lives. And they just happen to work on this one show together. But there is value and importance in remembering who they were and this amazing show that they contributed to theater history. I think the 2016 Shuffle Along was really important in reintroducing people like me, frankly, to this amazing bit of theater history. And, I think George C. Wolfe did it yet again with his Ma Rainey film. That was an August Wilson show or an August Wilson play, but Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which was just on Netflix, once again is bringing this historical figure to the masses. I think there's such value in the telling of the story of what transpired back in 1921, whether that is on stage, whether that's in book form, whether that is in a film. I mean, I would love to see the story told on screen in some way. But I just think there's such value in it because while I was writing, I could not stop thinking about all of the people who are in theater programs who want to see themselves on stage. And while part of me thought about all of the Black and brown kids or artists who want to be on a Broadway stage and they're taking dance lessons and vocal lessons and they're in school, I also thought about what value there also is for all of the white performers in that same position to know that this show existed as well. Because learning about women's history isn't just for women, it's also for men. Learning about Black history isn't just for Black people, it's about all people, because there's value in that. And so I think the 2016 Shuffle Along was really important in reminding people that this show existed. And I think that Footnotes, having the opportunity to do a deeper dive into the lives of each of these performers will hopefully go even deeper into letting people know what was so incredibly significant about these performers in this moment in time. My name is Caseen Gaines, and if you want to learn more about my book, Footnotes, The Black Artist Who Rewrote the Rules of the Great White Way, you can find it at any book retailer, and you can find more information about it at my website, CaseenGaines.com. That's CaseenGaines.com. Find me on social media at Caseen Gaines and let me know how you like the book. And I'll see you at the theater.